Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm Tony Giddens. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone here this evening to this auspicious debate, the title of which is up here, and which I think is, as Mary Kaldor will say, is connected with the publication of the yearbook of for the study of civil society from the Center for the Study of Global Governance. Can I briefly introduce our four panelists? Very briefly, because there are four of them. Mary Kaldor is Professor of Global Governance at the LSE and Director of the Center for the Study for Global Governance. And I have to say I was very pleased to lure her to the LSE when I was Director of the LSE from her bolt hole down in Sussex, and she's had a very big impact on the institution since she came here. Ziba Mir-Hosseini is Senior Research Associate at the Center of Islamic and Middle Eastern Law at SOAS, and holds a variety of degrees, and the author of numerous works, but also, interestingly, made some very well-known films, including Divorce Iranian Style. Rita Payne is the current chair of the Commonwealth Journalists Association. She's the former Asia editor for BBC World, and she worked at the BBC for nearly 30 years in a very distinguished career. Zarni is connected to the Center for Global Governance. He's the founder of the Free Burma Coalition. He's an activist pressing for democratic change in Burma, deploying numerous sorts of resources in order to do so, including the resources of the internet, which is bound to figure substantially in the discussion tonight. So let me ask you just to give a little round of applause to our speakers before they say anything. Thank you. Well, I now turn to Mary, first of all, to speak, and each speaker will speak for only 10 minutes, and then we'll have interaction with the audience. Mary?
Well, thank you very much, Tony, and I just want to say back again how grateful I am to Tony for having brought me here to the LSE and how much I miss you. So come back, Tony. And as Tony explained, this is part of a study we did for our yearbook. It was last year's yearbook called Communicative Power and Democracy. I'm just showing it to you. But we've also just brought out a new one, which I've got a copy of for you to all see, on poverty and activism, which we did jointly with the Tata Institute of Social Studies in Mumbai. So it's all about slumdog millionaires. I thought I'd start just by mentioning something which isn't in the chapter at all, but I think is a really interesting phenomenon, pointed out to me actually by one of my students, which is, I don't know if any of you have heard of Ushahidi. Ushahidi is a website started in Kenya during the riots, and Ushahidi means testimonial in Swahili. And what people started doing was using their mobile phones to report where there was violence or where there was a problem, and upload their reports to a mobile phone, which was a sort of security measure as well as a witness measure, so everybody knew what was happening. And the model has been taken up. Well, first it was used in Gaza, which means we have much more information than ever before about what happened in Gaza. You can look up the website. It's promoted by Al Jazeera, and people rang up on their mobile phones and said, this is what happened here. And now there's one for swine flu. So the reason I'm giving you this example is it's actually one of the many examples we came across in this study, which shows how there are global connections even in the most violent and repressive places, and how important those global connections are. We did this study for the yearbook of Illiberal Regimes, and what struck us was how little there has been on illiberal regimes since the end of the Cold War. It was very fashionable during the Cold War years to study totalitarianism, to study what Weber called sultanism, to study authoritarianism, But after the end of the Cold War, the preoccupation of scholars was with the spread of democracy, and there has really been no systematic study of what is the character of non-democratic regimes, we called them illiberal regimes, in the post-Cold War period. And we thought the way to study these is not in the traditional way that you look at the nature of the state, but rather to look at the nature of the spaces that exist. And the more the spaces that exist, well, the more one hopes it will move towards in a liberal form. So this study was simply to look at what spaces exist in illiberal regimes, and we took 6 countries as cases, but we took lots of other examples. They were Burma, China, North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Belarus. And today we've got someone from Iran and someone from Burma who will talk more about it. So I just want, in my very short introduction, to say 3 things that came out of this study. The first was that illiberal regimes are today different from, at least from the totalitarian and sultanistic regimes of earlier periods, because of the spaces that exist. It really isn't any longer possible to have a closed authoritarian state. That's even true in North Korea. In North Korea, for example, there is, and you might not say that's a space, it's not civil society, I don't know what you'd call it, but it's an economic space. There is a whole lot of smuggling over the border with China in the north, mostly women for brides in China because of the shortage of women. And in order to organize it, they've developed a mobile phone network, and through the mobile phone network, they get all kinds of other information about what's going on in the rest of the world. Similarly, in Burma, I mean, Burma and North Korea, I guess, were our most closed societies that we studied. And I'm sure Zarni will tell you more about that. You know, there are tea shops, there are internet connections, there are places, even in homes, where people can meet. And in fact, what we did mainly in this was to describe those spaces. And I'm not going to give you a great description because I hope we will hear more from others. But we described the ideas, we described the issues. I think on the ideas, perhaps the most interesting thing is that perhaps the most powerful current in illiberal regimes is what we call reform ideas, not necessarily ideas that are purely liberal ideas, though Aung Suu Kyi does represent that, but ideas that somehow are within the dominant discourse. And I'm sure Ziba will talk about the new religious thinking in Iran, she may, but that's certainly within Islam, but it's a reformist approach within Islam. And in China, one of the most interesting things is this notion of rightful resistance, that you resist on the basis of rights that exist within the constitution and within the ruling ideology. We described issues. People are active on things like HIV/AIDS. Environmental issues are often very important in illiberal regimes. We described the type of activists, women, youth, NGOs, and we described above all spaces, of which virtual space, which there's a lot, is of course absolutely crucial, but there are other spaces, religious institutions, universities, people's homes. The media, of course, is another very important space, and cities abroad. London is an incredibly important space for many illiberal regimes, and many of the most important newspapers of, say, Saudi Arabia are published here in London. So that was our first conclusion, was that there were spaces. Our second conclusion is that what determines the nature of the regime is what's inside those spaces. In other words, it's not, you know, in the past we thought about what's internal and what's external. These are global spaces, actually, created by the internet, created by trade. They may be economic spaces, they may be political spaces. But some of the spaces are filled by progressive people, but a lot of the spaces are filled by what we call, and have started to call in our yearbook, regressive globalisation, the underside of globalisation. they're filled by criminal tendencies allied to extremist ideologies, whether they're religious fundamentalism, Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, nationalism of an extreme kind in Belarus. It's the fact that there is regressive globalization that actually sustains often these illiberal regimes. So that's the second conclusion, that they remain not because in power because they're coercive. They actually don't have the coercive apparatus to sustain themselves. They remain in power because there are illiberal spaces or aggressive globalized spaces. And I guess the final conclusion that follows from all this is that if you're an outsider, actually, the traditional coercive methods, and by which I mean sanctions and at its extreme military intervention, are not very effective in liberalizing such regimes. They may have the opposite effect. And it's very obvious in the case of somewhere like Iraq. What the intervention in Iraq did was to stimulate regressive globalization. What it did was to stimulate crime and to stimulate extremist ideologies. And sanctions often do the same thing. Sometimes sanctions work. They don't always not work. And obviously they worked in South Africa if they're allied to liberals inside the regime. And so the real conclusion is if you really want to change illiberal regimes from the outside, then the only way is through communication. The only way is actually engaging in those spaces and shifting from regressive to progressive globalization. And interestingly enough, that's what many of, in the course of doing this, we did our studies, both through looking at the available literature, but also we sort of engaged in email correspondence with whoever we could reach inside the countries. And that's what almost everybody told us. They said, we want to be engaged with a global civil society. We want to know what's going on in your conferences. We want to come. And one Chinese said to us, globalization is actually our only hope for democracy. So globalization is both positive and negative. And the question is, how do we engage with it in such a way as to push the positive tendencies?
Thank you. Ziba?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. In their chapter on global society and illiberal regimes, Mary Kaldor and Denisa Kostovikova, they write, I quote, "Civil society in an illiberal regime is shaped and constrained by its own repressive political environment as well as complex global connections. These global connections, of course, include international politics." In my brief remarks here, I basically want to do three things, and I'm sure that I won't have to do them adequately. So I want to stress first that how liberal Western regimes may not only constrain civil society in illiberal regimes, but also delegitimize and silence it. In many Muslim contexts, there is a kind of symbiotic relation between their illiberal regimes and Western liberal democracies, in a sense that they need each other, they constitute each other. And this is really the case in the Middle East. And I also what I want to do is to focus on Iran and also show that how the efforts of the civil society and its actors to break down this symbiotic relationship in the course of 20th century have been frustrated. And I take this opportunity also to talk a little bit about the upcoming presidential elections in Iran. And these presidential elections have several features that I think, if everything works properly, can break down this symbiotic relationship. And the role of the new media is extremely important here. And Iran, Persian after English and French, is the third blog language. And the new media, and especially the internet and Facebook, have really is playing a very important role in this election. And also the issue of gender equality has become central to the elections. In the course of the 20th century, Iran had two revolutions. And in both revolutions, democracy, rule of law and independence were among the main demands and slogans of the revolutionary. The first revolution, known as Constitutional Revolution, unfolded between 1906 and 1911, ended an absolute monarchy, created a parliament, and the second revolution, which grew in the course of 1970s, led to, in 1979, into an Islamic republic. Both revolutions ended up creating illiberal regimes in Iran. The first one was a secular, modernizing illiberal regime upheld and supported by the Western liberal democracies. And the second is a theocratic, a mixture of theocratic and democratic regime, which has a great deal of popularity in the Muslim world. Outside intervention has already several times both provoked and frustrated Iranians' struggle for democracy. Iranians are well aware of the US and UK-backed coup in 1953 that toppled the democratic government of Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized the Iranian oil industry. And all Iranians know, and it is very fresh in the memory, that the same Western liberal regimes supported Saddam Hussein's 8-year war on Iraq between 1980 and 1988. The result of both interventions were catastrophic, not only for Iran, but also for Western interests in the regime. The 1953 coup was the undoubted precursor of 1979 revolution. Without that coup, there would have been no Islamic revolution. And also, without the invasion of Iraq, the revolution would have never taken such a course and would not result into a clerical theocracy. And since the establishment of Islamic Republic, Iran has been holding election almost every other year. And the election has become so central to the Iranian politics and also the way that people and civil society engage with the state, at times undermine it, at times, they're totally subordinated by the state. And by the early 1990s, there was a dialogue which was fostered between the reformist elements of the Iranian civil society and also the government, who tried to democratize and liberalize the Iranian regime from within. And among the elections that Iran has had, so far, 2 elections have taken Iranians by surprise and the outsiders by surprise. The first one was the 1997 election, presidential election, when Mohammad Khatami, the candidate that nobody in Iran thought had any chance, won with a landslide and brought the reformist movement and new ideas into the structure of power. And the second election, which took Iranian and the world by surprise, was the 2005 when Ahmadinejad, the current president, a hardliner, was chosen. I don't have time to go to explain why it has happened, but basically the fact that Khatami's election had a lot to do with the opening from inside after the end of the war with Iraq and after the period of reconstruction that started. And Ahmadinejad's election and his victory to a large extent owes to the politics of the war of terror and the invasion of Iraq, which really enforced the hand of hardliners and put the reformists in Iran on a crossfire. And also because people in Iran, the civil society actors, mainly the students group, among the civil society actors in Iran, students group and women are the main actors and main players. They boycotted the election because they were frustrated, disillusioned with the speed of reforms, and at the same time, they were none of those who really boycotted the election in 2005 had imagined that by their boycotting election, they would leave the field open to the radical forces, because they thought that the election result would be between Rafsanjani, who represented the establishment but a moderate, and also one of the reformist candidates. But then Ahmadinejad won. And looking back, there is a great deal of discussion and debate that whether he won through a fair election process or whether the elections were rigged. But definitely one can say it was the first presidential election that went into the second round in Iran. And by the time that it went to the second round, Ahmadinejad presented himself as the candidate who speaks for justice, for bringing oil money on people's table, and also standing up to imperialism. So all these elements play the hand there. And now we are 12th of June would be the 10th presidential election. And this presidential election has several features that really distinguishes it from the other election. First is that given the lack of access to official and print media, because what happened was in the second presidency of Khatami and also during the Ahmadinejad's presidency, the print media has now and the television is under the control of the conservative forces. So the reformists have no access to that. And reformists now conducting the bulk of their campaign through the alternative media. That is cyberspace and also weblogs and Facebook. And the two important arms, and the second feature of this election which is important, is that two important arms of civil society in Iran, that is women's group and students, have seized the space that has opened up during the election. Because during the election time, traditionally in Iran, the level of tolerance of the authorities and regime raises a little bit. So the issues can be raised, and this is a time that for the first time, women's group and students have used it in order to put their demands and agendas and insert it into the election. On 25th of April, during a press conference, Women's Coalition, a number of women's rights activists announced the formation of a new coalition called Women's Coalition for Voicing Women's Demands in the Election. And they entered the election scene with two specific demands. And the first is for Iran to join CEDAW, the Convention for Discrimination of all forms of discrimination, for elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. This convention was ratified in 2002 by the reformist parliament during the Khatami's presidency. But it was blocked by the Guardian Council, and its fate has been undecided. When Ahmadinejad was elected, his government announced that the Minister of Women's Affairs, not the Minister of Women's Affairs, the person who runs the Center for Women, she said that as long as I am alive, as long as his government is there, this convention is not going to be ratified. So that became a point of contention, and women are now demanding for ratification of the convention, in a way inserting the convention into the election agenda. And the second demand or specific issue that women have raised is revision of 4 articles of Iranian constitution. All these 4 articles somehow, because the Iranian constitution is extremely ambiguous and ambivalent on the issue of rights and equality. All these 4 articles recognize equality in the realm of the family and women's equality, but make it subordinate to interpretations of Islamic law or the Sharia. And these interpretations are patriarchal interpretations so far. So they are asking for the revision of the constitution. So in a way, they are directly challenging the authority, the clerical authority. What is also new is how this disparate women's group have joined forces in the coalition to make their election, to make this election a contest between the two reformist candidates. That is between Mehdi Karoubi, who is a clerical candidate, and Mir-Hosseini Mousavi, a lay candidate. And in fact, by doing this, they have bypassed the authority of the state-controlled media to influence the agenda and the debates. What enables them to do is the new media, and the entire campaign is, as I said, is conducted on the website and weblog, mobile phone, SMS, and Facebook. And the use of this media for the debate and exchange of ideas and for engaging the candidates, they really use this media. And in doing so, they are creating a momentum that is undermining the channels and structures on which the unelected theocratic forces successfully relied in the previous elections and so far. That is the reliance on the mosque, the reliance on the militia, the reliance on the structure of the power, and they're really undermining this. Clearly, we cannot tell that how many Iranians are following this virtual campaign. But as we are told, 20 million have access to internet, and 40 million have mobile phones in Iran out of the population of 70, and a comparable number watch TV satellite. And recently in January, BBC have joined in producing Persian TV program there. And these programs are watched. And also there is a good chance that a substantial proportion of the electorates will be at the very least aware of this campaign. In conclusion, I want to say, end by an optimistic note and say that I have hope that this particular election campaign has a chance to transform Iranian politics. It seems that it has empowered some of the conservatives and illiberal forces. And to my knowledge, the only conservative candidate, who is Ahmadinejad now and has the support of the supreme leader, has not used this space. And whenever he tried to do this space, it has backfired. And also, it is bypassing in a way, I think it is also bypassing the perception that the Iranian politicians have that the elections are an arena that they need to stand up to the West. Somehow it is bypassing that. And it is finally, I find it a hopeful sign that President Obama today has declared that he will not be approaching Iran with further diplomatic overtures until after the election is over. So probably the international realm has changed. The language of war, of terror, it seems to be changing. So we might see impact on Iranian politics as well.
Thank you. Well, Zarni, I'll turn to you now. I think our next two contributors both got pictures.
No, I have just a few slides of text.
Oh, that's what I mean.
Yeah, thank you.
Visuals, then.
Yeah. I have two things on my mind. One is, of course, the current unfolding, this farcical trial of Aung San Suu Kyi in Rangoon, and I think that has recaptured the world's imagination, and for the past 72 hours or so, I've been staying up really late trying to communicate with my colleagues inside the country until they would say, okay, I've got to go because there's
a power, to the mic, maybe.
Power outage, and so because that's a regular occurrence over there. And the second is my wife is 39th week in her pregnancy, and so I had to turn my cell phone off talking, and so I couldn't rush off when something like a crowning happens. But the point of mentioning the trial in Rangoon, and also saying that I've been staying up late and also, like watching news here, is to
and you're on the news as well.
to buttress Mary's argument that there is a global civil society, and that, this inside-outside thing has collapsed. This dichotomy is just fictitious, and it doesn't exist. And Burma is a living example of what she's arguing here. Also, the fact that in the post-Cold War period, a lot of scholars talked about democratization transition and didn't really pay much attention to the illiberal character. Not just the regimes and political structures, but societies there. And so when we're talking about the role of media in liberalizing societies under illiberal regimes, we must not make the assumption that once the illiberal structures, political structures, are removed, the society will necessarily be progressive and liberal. And so, again, like the Burmese case demonstrates, both the illiberal character and actually, I would argue here, less progressive or illiberal nature of the society in the course of my 10 minutes. What we have there, my argument. My first argument is that feudalistic, militaristic regime that has the trappings of a modern society and other administrative and judicial structures. The other one is that the society can be said to have been in existence, fairly continuously over the past, say, 1 millennium. And if you juxtapose that to 1,000 years of peasant society of different ethnic backgrounds, having gone through different illiberal systems of governments, from absolute monarchy, justified through Buddhist kingly, Buddhist kingship discourse, to say British colonial rule, which was, by definition, colonial rule is not a liberal or social or political order. And then we were under the Japanese fascist military occupation for a short period. And then that was followed by just 1 decade of quasi or semi-democratic civilian rule from 1948 to 58. In 1958, there was the first military coup made to look like constitutional transfer of power. And then in 1962, a very decisive and formal coup. And so what I'm arguing here is that we have to take into account the nature and the history of the society, in which we would like to see this liberal impact, from the media. And when we say media in the internet age, the journalists and the professional media organizations no longer have the monopoly over how news is produced or how publicly relevant information is produced. From citizen journalists to bloggers to other amateurs who capture different images and stories and then transmitting them through perhaps established media organizations, but also through the internet and other electronic forms of mass communication. When we say news or publicly relevant information, let's just say news, for the most vivid example to understand news, at least to me, is to see news as not that different from either legally tradable consumer goods like the jeans or the shirts or microphone stereo sets, or contraband items, like automatic submachine guns. In other words, there is a process of manufacturing news. News is not something that pops out of, realities, as they unfold. And so, if you have a process of manufacturing, these, what others call symbolic goods, and there is an economic dimension to it. And one of my, or perhaps my major argument for tonight, as far as the Burmese struggle for human rights and democratization in Burma, is that the cardinal failure of the Burmese activists, including myself, and I would say Aung San Suu Kyi and others inside the country, is that we pay less attention to the economic dimension of creating these like communicative domains in the country, which can have double impact both on the political structures of the regime and on the illiberal realities of our culture and our social order. And so that said, there are three things that I wish to mention as far as the Burmese conflict in the country. One is the logistical and infrastructural nature of the information and media production in the country. Say like magazine, journals, and very conventional media materials. But at the same time, because the Burmese are not completely closed off. Actually, we are not as closed off as North Korea at all. It's not just possible for Burma to be closed off because we're sandwiched between two dynamic Asian economies, China and India. Plus, Southeast Asia, half of Southeast Asia has very dynamic economic regimes, such as Thailand, or Thailand's perhaps going down a bit, but Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. So what we have is a society that has access to information technology, satellite technology, computer software, hardware, mobile phones, satellite phones, dial-up telephones, satellite dishes, and all the information technology hardware. And then on top of that, the electricity is often, when we're talking about communications and impact on these societies, electricity has a very, very strategic role to play. That's electricity is the last thing activists and others would think about, in terms of pushing for these boundaries of communication. And the second aspect where the conflict takes place is this ideological component or symbolic content of news and media. And both the regimes and the activists in our country, as Mary said, are involved in both regressive and progressive aspects of globalization. In other words, the regime has its own friends, and activists have our own friends, in the form of INGOs operating in the country, journalists going there disguised as tourists, because if you apply as journalists for a Burmese visa, you will not get that. And so, there is a conflict and a struggle over who controls what comes out of Burma or what goes inside the country, and that's, that's a conflict both players are actively involved in. And the third and last element is these are symbolic goods when we're talking about news and publicly relevant information. It's, even if you eat a sandwich, or if, a kid cannot peel certain fruits. In other words, the users will have to have a certain intellectual capacity as well as educational capacity to basically unpack these goods, so that the content is not just a content, but it becomes part of the process of, say, liberalizing their attitude, norms, identity formation, as well as challenging, authority relations. If we look at state as not just an assemble of institutions, but as a set of social relations, then I think the impact on social relations, the nature of social relations from feudal or patron-client to more egalitarian and democratic becomes a very, very crucial element as well. The key point that I want to illustrate is the military is spending inordinate amount of their resources to train their elite, which they build or whom they build as future national leaders of Burma. The military is going for basically eternal rule. I mean, like the Burmese language that they use in the new constitution would have that eternity as part of their discourse. But at the same time, the military would let educational and other vital cultural and intellectual constitutions rot to the core. And so that's why, like, when Mary said, sanction is not necessarily the best approach to open up these illiberal societies under illiberal regimes, because the military would send, say, like literally a couple thousand military cadets to train in different technological and technical fields in countries like China, Singapore, India, though India is democratic, Russia. And while the opposition leadership or the opposition dissidents will have very few, relatively speaking, education and intellectual and cultural activities or opportunities vis-a-vis the military elite. And so you see, the capacity of the civil society or opposition will gradually go down because we are unable to invest. And also there are policies that are set up to basically disengage Burmese institutions such as universities with institutions in the West, because the argument is that would legitimize the regime because universities in Burma are under the Ministry of Education. So the final point I wish to illustrate is this economic disparity, the purchasing power disparity between the military regime and the civil society groups. And to do that, I'd like to bring up just a few slides. Just basically, it's data about the,
You have to accelerate a bit.
Yeah, it would just be 2 minutes. This is from an internet research survey. Can you just go all of them? Yes. The total estimate number of people wired or connected, it's a very wild guess, 40,000 to 500, very, very wild guess. But that's what's called like a penetration rate. It's less than 1% of a total of 50 million population of Burma, and Burma is the least, second least connected country in the world. The first is North Korea, and the next, please. And then the per capita annual income of Burma is $220 UNICEF, and the cost, and if you compare that per capita income with the cost of installing monthly charges, say like a broadband installation costs $1,500 US in a country where the per capita income is 220, and then the monthly charges is $45. And then the number of connections in the country, or 50 million, 3,000 maximum. That's like broadband and internet. The next one. Number of cyber cafes, 500, serving 10% of the total population in 2 major cities, Rangoon and Mandalay. And then you just put that in the larger context of total population and the purchasing power of communities. And the next one, please. And so you see, you get the point of this like massive like disparity between what the regime is able to spend on its own elite officer corps and what the society is able to come up with. And then finally, this is, I thought, a very poignant line from last night's chat with my friend in Rangoon. And we're talking about the trial, and at 12:49, now, this is his English, now power, electricity cut off here right now, I continue by battery. And then the next line is like, okay, I've got to go, the battery's gone. And then so, we can talk about a grand scheme about how to liberalize these societies and regimes, but electricity, economic disparity, they play major, major role.
Zarni has been a frequent guest on programs I used to produce on BBC World. And what I would like to talk about really is the changes that I've seen in news coverage and access to information from the region in the sort of many, many years I spent at the BBC. So I'll speak mainly from my experience as a program editor and what impact the changes have had, greater access to people in the region who can give us news, and also some of the risks involved, some of the concerns that we have. So until August last year, I was Asia editor at BBC World TV News. And every morning when I came to work, I would brace myself from complaints from embassies and high commissions and pressure groups complaining about some aspect of our coverage. The other thing would be you would get loads of press releases and statements from governments, loads of press releases from activist groups. And out of that, you had to try and make some sense and try and decide what order, how would you prioritize the news that you carried, what would you pick up. And there were all sorts of concerns and the reasons for the decision, which aren't always clear to people. People would often ask me and say, you know, why is it you're putting so much attention today and you're making this a headline story, whereas last week was only a tiny story? The truth can sometimes be that on a weekend, on an extremely quiet day, a story that would have been an end item becomes a lead item. So that's the reality of news. So generally, when we talk about illiberal regimes, we tend to think about countries like Burma and North Korea, maybe Iran, and possibly China, which again, in some aspects is opening up, and sometimes being tougher and closing up. But what I'd like to say quite a little bit today about Sri Lanka, because I think this is one country, and the situations there really encapsulate all the different issues, the challenges, the problems which can face someone working in the media. And also in the case of Sri Lanka, you know, one section of the population, for example, the Tamils, would consider the government to be totally illiberal. But if you notice from the jubilation and the celebrations, and there's a tremendous amount of support for the government in ending 26 years of, you know, a violent separatist campaign. So, you know, is Sri Lanka illiberal for everybody? You know, it's just something, you know, to consider. So what we've all been aware, of course, of the humanitarian crisis which has been unfolding in the north of the country. And, you know, there was concern, there was international outrage, because the army was determined to press ahead with its offensive against the Tamil Tiger rebels, despite international calls for a temporary truce. Because, you know, again, figures vary, but there were some estimates that up to 250,000 civilians were caught in this area of the fighting, which is a very narrow strip, with the rebels. And then there were also reports, which again couldn't be substantiated, that actually maybe the Tamil Tigers were using the civilians as human shields, and if they tried to escape, they were being shot. Again, you could not verify it, which is why you desperately need neutral sources in these countries, and especially a country like Sri Lanka. Now, my former colleague Chris Morris, who you may have all heard, who's been reporting on Sri Lanka, he's been there for many, many years, and he summed up the problems faced by the media there. He said, reporting from Sri Lanka at the moment is extremely difficult. There is no independent access to the northern war zone or to the thousands of Tamil civilians who've crossed over to government-controlled territory. He wrote this about 2 weeks ago. The only regular sources of information are the government on one side and websites sympathetic to the Tamil Tiger rebels, the LTTE. There is a propaganda war alongside the conflict on the ground, and confirming details of what is going on is almost impossible. Many journalists covering South Asia have been unable to get visas to travel to Sri Lanka. Some have tried to enter the country as tourists and been turned back at the airport. Those who do travel to the north independently are stopped at a series of checkpoints far away from the war zone. The government says this is a necessary precaution to ensure that journalists do not come to any harm. So Chris goes on to say that the past few months have been one of the most challenging times to report from Sri Lanka. But again, Sri Lanka has never been an easy war to cover. The Tamil Tigers themselves have always ruled areas under their control with an iron hand. Dissent has never been accepted, and many Tamil critics of the LTTE have been murdered over the years. And Chris goes on to describe how intolerant the Sri Lankan authorities have become of criticism. When he made a trip to Sri Lanka last year, the defense secretary at the time, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who's the president's brother, told Chris that in a time of war, all dissent was treason. And a few days later, in a front-page newspaper report, the minister accused Chris Morris of supporting the Tamil Tigers and threatened to chase him out of the country. So the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and several foreign embassies have also been the target of criticism. So with access denied to journalists, the media has to rely on government and pro-Tamil sources as TamilNet. If I could have the first slide, please. And you'll just see, even today, an image taken from the TamilNet website, which is the pro-LTTE site. And they, at the moment, as you can see, you've got a tussle. What do you believe? The government is saying that they have killed the Tamil Tiger leader, Prabhakaran. The TamilNet and the Tamil people are refusing to believe it. They think it's a big plot to discredit the government. So under these conditions, you find with Sri Lanka, it's almost impossible to win. I actually spoke yesterday, while I was preparing my presentation, to Professor Rajiva Wijesena, who is the Secretary General of the Secretariat for coordinating the peace process. And every time there's any report from Human Rights Watch, Britain, anywhere critical, he would say that's all pro-LTTE. So I said, look, would you mind just giving me a couple of sentences on what do you think has actually been wrong, that the Western media, in your view, has been doing wrong in reporting the situation. And he said, you might simply consider the failure of the international media to apply rational argument to their acceptance of whatever is placed before them by their tigers and their allies. In particular, the surge of propaganda 8 days ago followed the first breach since April in the imprisoning defensive walls with an exodus of nearly 1,000. The shooting then began specifically to stop people leaving, and that succeeded. So what we've had, as you can see in recent days, we've had demonstrations from Sinhalese in Colombo who are very angry with the international, and especially with the British government, for intervening and calling for a ceasefire, and you had Tamils who are accusing the government of not doing enough. And that is where I expect we will continue to face, the media will continue to face challenges like this in various other hotly disputed parts of the world. Since Zarni has already covered Burma, I will skip that, only to say that Zarni had already mentioned the fact that a lot of journalists are going in, sneaking into Burma as tourists. And it was quite amusing because there was a friend of mine who was a journalist, and she said she was in Burma during the protests by the monks, and she was in the hotel, and every other person was a journalist. But they all pretended not to know each other. And then on another occasion, we had another journalist, this is later on during, could we show the pictures, please, of the monks' protests? Yes. So these are sort of images that were sent to us, which we use. These were images which were sent. Usually campaigning and activist groups are very quick and very responsive in sending us material. I'll mention later on the problems one has about verifying and to be sure that you're not being manipulated in any way by the people who are sending you the material. Then I'll move on to say the Tibet protests in Lhasa in March 2008, which will be the next slide, please. Now, these have been sent to me by the International Campaign for Tibet. And so she, of course, said they had to be careful. They had images sent to them. They went to great lengths to verify these images, and they would pass them on to us. Now, there is a very tragic, if you could have the next slide, please. Yes. Now, this is very sad, which has not been sent to the media. And what Kate was telling me today was that this is a woman who was supposed to have been shot dead. And because it was quite grisly, quite grotesque, they were able to find out that she was shot dead when police opened fire at a protest in Kirti in March 2008. But she said a lot of the images they get is either poor quality or something like this, which would be too upsetting, they felt, for viewers. So, but what Kate did point out is it's quite interesting that at this time of the economic downturn, the Chinese government is embarking on a multi-billion-dollar media expansion overseas, including the establishment of a 24-hour English-language all-news channel modeled after CNN and the opening of Xinhua offices across the world. So, but in the meantime, the Chinese government has been quick and is blocking access to all of the media. So there is a tussle going on and a race to see, if the government will be quicker and faster in introducing more control than it can. And I will now finish with what I consider to be a positive story of where the media is generally regarded to have been good news and done good, and that will be last. And that's the Maldives. Now, I'll talk about this because this is where the internet new media is credited with ending the authoritarian rule of Maung Gayoom, who'd been a president for 30 years. And he was defeated in elections in 2008 and replaced by Mohammed Nasheed. Now, while Gayoom was in power, the next slide, please, the man who is now president was actually jailed and sent into exile to remote Maldivian islands for a total of nearly 6 years. Now, at the time, at the height of these protests, there was Ahmed Shahid, who was then the foreign minister, and he would come to see me, and he would say, look, I don't want this publicly known, but we are having dealings behind the scenes with some of them with the opposition parties. But eventually, Gayoom was going to introduce reform, not going to introduce reform, and then eventually Ahmed Shahid, felt frustrated, he withdrew from the government, and then I met him again last week, and he's foreign minister again. And then I spoke to him about the changes and what had come about. And he said, it was again the internet, because Gayoom had complete control of the media. So he was able to portray himself and his family. They were almost like royalty. And ordinary Maldivians believed what they saw on television. And then with the internet, then you had cartoons of Gayoom. And slowly, you had the internet media, everything chipping away at this grand image that Gayoom had created. And ultimately, with all the news and the internet and the outcry generally, Gayoom introduced reforms. And then finally, we have Nasheed, who is now president. But what I've always said to them, this is a test, is the opposition parties love the media when they're in power. But when they're in government, it can be a different story. So at the moment, I'll leave it saying that yes, they are very pleased, they're very grateful to the BBC, to all other media organizations. When things get tough, when the media reports and things that they quite don't like, then that is really the time to see what they do. So these are just some thoughts I thought I'd share with you.
Well, thank you. I think I agree. 4 really interesting and pretty complimentary presentations. We've got about 25 minutes for questions, so I invite questions hopefully short and hopefully directed at particular members of the panel. Peter, is there a microphone somewhere? Yes, there is.
Thank you very much. This is really more of an observation, I think, than a question, and it's perhaps directed to all panel members. And it's this idea of an international or a global civil society and the extent to which perhaps it can be broken down into different audiences within that civil society. Because I'm thinking of the example that was Rita just gave of a 24-hour English language news channel from China. And I know that Russia have one, and Iran also have one called Press TV. And I think these are kind of different sorts of examples of how maybe the illiberal regimes are themselves trying to talk to global civil society, and they have their own interests. And I remember watching Russia Today's coverage of the unilateral independence of Kosovo, and it was clearly putting a very different view on what the message that they wanted to go out on Kosovo, say to CNN or even to Al Jazeera. So it's really just some kind of observations from the panel on the different sort of breaking down what we mean by global civil society.
Yeah, thank you. Who would like to respond to that?
Well, I think it's a very important point, and maybe one should talk about global civil societies. Certainly, it's a very sort of pluralistic environment. But I think one of the things that came out very interestingly from our studies was obviously the internet now is a scene of attempts by governments to control it. And you now have internet dissidents who've been jailed, and we have a nice box in the yearbook about all the attempts to filter, to arrest, to deal with, to try to cut down on freedom in the internet, which particularly in Iran. But the interesting thing about it is there are limits to this process. And part of it is technical, that the technology changes so much that it's always possible to find clever ways to get around. One of the Burmese people, actually, that we were in touch with had some very complicated way of reaching us, but it took him almost an hour to get through this complicated way. But the other part is just exactly what you're saying, that the regimes themselves need the internet to propagate their messages. So actually, they're constantly torn between wanting to control it and wanting not to control it so they can propagate their own messages. And that's really exactly what you're saying. That, and I suppose my faith that globalisation is going to end up by being positive rather than negative relies on the fact that when people have access to different types of media, in the end, if you have some kind of faith in human beings, as the freer it is, the more likely they are to make better choices. But it's not necessary. The more different media they can see.
So Vicky.
I was struck by Zarni's description that the battle between activism and the Burmese military regime is basically about trying to stop things going in and out of the country. And I think that's particularly true in terms of activists' approach, in terms of trying to prevent tourists from going in. Tourists are actually a big pressure for opening up internet cafes. If a country wants to have a good tourism business, it has to do that. The activists want to stop companies from going in. Companies equally want fast internet connections. And they're trying to also stop actual internet companies, ISPs, going in as well. So one of the impacts of activism on Burma has been to reduce the availability of the internet in Burma. My question, though, is in Iran, why isn't Ahmadinejad closing down Facebook and so on? And is it because internally within Iran there is pressure from the private sector, from those who are engaged in the outside world, to keep the internet going?
Yes, to a large extent it is that. And also another part of it is that the Iranian bureaucracy or the Iranian state actually has become reformist. So the change has really happening within the Iranian state. And even among the conservatives, there is a debate that whether, because for Iranians it's very important to have economic success. And to do that, they need to use the new technology and science. So there is a debate there. And there is something also about the whole technology or the use or appropriation of certain media that changes, bring the change. I remember at the very beginning of the revolution in 1979, there was a huge debate whether cinema is going to be banned or not. But eventually they decided to keep it because it was in the service of the revolution. But what happened was they wanted to create a generation of ideologues, create an Islamic cinema. But what happened was the art really changed the Iranian cinema, and the art imposed itself on it. And I think the same thing somehow is happening with this new technology. You know, the medium is also changing those who are using it.
Just a brief comment. Vicky was the British ambassador to Burma and Rangoon for 3.5 years, and she knows the situation very well. One thing I wanted to mention is I returned to Burma after, say, 16 years of exile in the U.S., and I was the guest of the regime in their guest house, basically intelligence, one of the intelligence locations, and I was in their hands 24/7, except when I was sitting on the toilet, and there was always a couple of officers around me. And so what was interesting was that I needed to communicate with my daughter, who I left in the U.S., and also some of my closest colleagues and friends. So I set up a new email account that doesn't have any resemblance to anything of me, and I would be right under the immediate nose of intelligence officer. From an internet cafe, I will be communicating with Vicky and others, and I suppose I was lucky enough not to have one of those Russian or Chinese trained counterintelligence officer assigned to me, because they would be staring at the computer screen and didn't know what I was writing or what I was doing. I was trying to like go through evade the firewalls and stuff. So that's why I think it's really crucial for the growth of cyber cafes. And then like Vicky said, one of the mistakes that we have made was calling for the boycott of tourism on moral grounds. It feels good, but it is unstrategic. It is not helping the cause.
I was just wondering, to go back to the question, maybe this is a question for Mary again. Is there a point at which you can quantify this question? Is there a point at which access to the internet, access to mobile phone services actually can make a difference, and you start seeing a shift from illiberal to liberal?
Maybe Iran is at that point. I mean, that was striking of all our studies, that internet access was much greater in Iran than any of the other countries that we looked at. And we actually start our chapter with a little quote from an Iranian saying, at night, every light that is on in Tehran is someone driving through the internet road. But on a previous, one of the things we try to do in the yearbook is to have lots of data and lots of statistics, and we've consistently had data on internet access, and we did some really interesting statistics on how there was actually a link between the degree of internet access and the degree of authoritarianism. Of course, it's statistically very difficult to do, but we took the World Bank's index on authoritarianism and we took internet, and it came out very, very clearly. So whether there's a moment of change, that I don't know, but it does seem to me there's pretty good evidence that there is a positive correlation between internet connections and liberal.
Rita, do you want to comment on that at all? Being inside the media or something?
No, I have something, I'm coming from a different angle, is that what I did discover was quite interesting with China. There were various developments which surprised us and surprised the Chinese. For example, the Chinese were really, really angry with the West, with our coverage of the protests in Tibet. And I think to a certain degree, we may have been maybe slightly to blame in the sense that because the campaigners, the pro-Tibet campaigners, were so vocal, you had glamorous people like Joanna Lumley, everyone loved the Dalai Lama, so really almost 3, 4, 5 times a day, everybody would be on from some pro-Tibet group. And then after a while, I received a call from a Chinese writer who's based in London, and she said, Rita, she said, I'm so disappointed, a lot of my friends are disappointed, because she said, we used to look up to the BBC. And now we found it's just one-sided reporting. And she said, we're terribly disillusioned, and a lot of us are beginning to think that, the BBC's almost as propagandist of the Chinese government. Because, of course, then we realized there were not many Chinese voices who were coming and giving their views what was going on. And then they also felt that we didn't report the pro-Chinese government rallies and the people who had been around, because it was almost instinctive that you thought this was oppressed. And of course the Chinese took full advantage of some of the shots where a few of the Tibetans were seen to be a bit violent, and they sort of showed that over and over again. So all the mass Chinese people said, oh well, the Chinese are violent. So that was what Tibetans, sorry. And then the other thing that happened is then, shortly after that, when we had the earthquake, then suddenly the Chinese were surprised, because they suddenly found that, but the Western reports, media reports, were favorable, because they were more, if you remember, the Prime Minister went to meet the people, and the Chinese were also praised the government for the way they handled it. And suddenly they were sort of thrown by saying, all of a sudden, when they were used to the Western media hammering them, then all of a sudden they have some favorable coverage. But so it's quite interesting to see that they themselves were puzzled, and how there's a sort of nationalism growing at the moment in China, which again, when they blocked the BBC for a while, and suddenly they found when the Chinese masses and they were on the internet blogs, there was support of the government, and the government thought, actually, we let the Western media report because it's working in our favor then.
Well, I just came back from Italy, where Mr. Berlusconi owns about 85% of the Italian media, or whatever one makes of that. Could you wait for a mic, maybe, to get to you?
This is a question for Mary. Mary, you mentioned in your introduction that London is a very important place to these liberal regimes. Why is this?
It's just simply because there are lots and lots of diaspora groups that live in London. In other words, I don't say it's terribly important for the regimes. I'm saying it's terribly important for the spaces inside these countries, that you will find dissident groups, including the Tamils, to take the Sri Lankan example, but where there's a very lively political debate going on, whether it's among Saudi dissidents, and interestingly in the Saudi case, it's between the establishment and the dissidents. It's the area where they actually communicate with each other. But you'll find newspapers, medias, debates going on all over London, because London is full of people from different illiberal regimes.
Observations?
Yes, mine is about the Burma situation. I find it a bit disheartening that, considering Burma's history, the past extremes of British rule and Japanese fascism you mentioned, is there not a dilemma in terms of a limited choice for the military regime to liberalize Burma's institutions, considering the internal social and economic chaos there?
Can you repeat the last bit? I missed it completely.
Yeah, in terms of, is there not a dilemma for the regime, considering liberalization of Burma's institution and the internal social and economic chaos within the country?
Yeah. You know, when I say we have to take into account the nature of the society and the historical background, I don't mean it in a deterministic way. You know, just simply because the Burmese did not have a democratic tradition as a political practice doesn't mean that you know, they have to go through another 800 years of evolution, you know, to get to where they need to be. You know, we're not talking about full-blown you know, Western liberal democratic polity. We're talking about basically a government that is decent and humane and takes into account as its own priority the well-being of the people. And so in that, you know, in that regard, what the regime needs to do is not necessarily radically either give up power or, you know, like be the main democratizer, which they are incapable psychologically and intellectually. And in terms of the regime's argument that it needs to be there because of internal instability or the potential or perceived or the real, I think it is self-serving. If there is a dilemma, it is a self-serving dilemma. So, you know, this is akin to what people like Lee Kuan Yew argue in the past, you know, Asian values. You know, in the first place, there is not a single set of Asian value that all Asians share. You know, Asia is an extremely diverse civilizational context. And then so, you know, so if balkanization or like, you know, control of the social chaos in the country is made by these regimes, you know, then certainly, you know, it smacks of this desire to self-justify.
Can you wait for the mic, because then everyone can hear?
Do you have any special opinion about the Italian policy on asking ID and photo and passport to go to a cybercafe in any part of Italy?
Iran or Italy? Italy, I think Tony would be in a better position. Italy, just coming back from that.
No, Mary, you answer, because you're the guru of the whole thing.
Am I the guru? It sounds like a mad idea to me. It's just incredible, and it's really dangerous sign, and something that we should be terribly worried about, I think. Yeah. Happy
Yeah.
to.
It's a sizing for terrorist control. You have to decide this in every internet.
But you're not going to say how it relates to your arguments, because this is a country with very high level of internet penetration and all the rest of it, and in the wider world and part of the European Union and so forth. How does it fit or not fit with your... I mean, since I haven't read the yearbook, I don't know what the arguments are, but how does it fit with...
And also a liberal democracy.
Well, I mean, pretty much, because, yeah.
Well, I was thinking...
You know, it's often said Italy wouldn't get into the EU if it applied to join
the
now.
question, but another part of what we did in this book was to talk about the paradox. I mean, here we're talking about illiberal regimes, but actually what does it mean to democratize? And one of the features of globalization has been the spread of democracy. But actually, it's been, as we argue, the spread, if you like, of democratic procedures. And in fact, if by democracy you actually mean the ability to influence the situation in which you live, globalization has both, on the one hand, increased the procedures of democracy, but on the other hand, precisely because the important decisions that affect where you live are not necessarily taken by the state, but can be taken by in all sorts of things, it hasn't necessarily increased substantive democracy. And in fact, one of the things that we've been arguing is the spread of democracy has something, a formal procedures of elections has something to do with the integration of the world. That's what it's really about. Less about people being able to influence their lives and more about creating acceptable members of the international community. And the struggle is, how do you actually, of course it creates conditions in which you could be more liberal, in which there could be more freedom, but it doesn't necessarily follow that that's the case. It opens up spaces. And I guess if we go back to the case of Italy, Italy's part of the European Union, it has high internet penetration, but an awful lot of all that matters who controls internet penetration, who controls the media, and you have a big problem with Berlusconi. But you also have a struggle going on, and that comes out in the book as well, that there is a struggle about controlling the internet. The war on terror has been an attempt also to control the internet. So there's something going on. Governments are aware of what a problem the internet is.
But could you argue that sometimes the internet actually produces illiberal tendencies itself? I mean, and how would you deal with Rita's point of contesting versions of illiberality within the same society? Because you could perhaps argue that the internet might sometimes exacerbate such conflicts rather than
well, and
reduce
that is our point about regressive globalization. I mean, and if you look at how Al-Qaeda mobilizes, it's through these hideous websites. So actually there's a kind of anarchy going on the internet. And there's, I mean, in fact, one of the interesting things about somewhere like the BBC is that news is controlled and filtered by people like Rita. And the internet lacks that filtering process. So, in fact, people are exposed to very illiberal arguments. So that was my real point, that my optimism stems from the fact that if people see both illiberal arguments and liberal arguments, they may be more likely to choose liberal arguments. But it doesn't necessarily follow, and that's the whole point. Illiberal regimes are not necessarily closed regimes. They're regimes where people promote illiberal ideas.
Can I mention just one thing that we haven't touched on when we're talking about liberalizing societies and systems under illiberal regimes? That is the basically corporate control of natural resources. If you look at the natural resource-rich countries, they are often under illiberal regimes, and there is a very direct correlation between the natural resource endowment, rich endowment, and poor human rights record. And it would be incomplete when we argue for liberalizing these countries and societies without touching on the issue of natural resource extractive industry and the way in which modern life has become wholly dependent on this. And so, you know, there's a dialectic going on here. You know, we don't know which one is a cause, which one is a fact. I mean, the effect.
Could you just I don't quite understand the argument. Could you clarify that maybe?
One would be saying like the phenomena of natural resource curse. You know, in like
the curse of oil, you mean?
The curse of, it could be any type of minerals or timber, you know, extractive industry. And it is one of the most powerful industries in the world. And when they can mobilize, armies and security forces, and these are guys who call on presidents and prime ministers and armed forces, chiefs of staff, to safeguard their assets in these illiberal contexts. If, say, for instance, you know, when you mentioned the socialist government nationalized the Iranian gas, you know, there was a response, you know, that you are reeling from that response today, you know, if we want to follow your logic historically. So I think in terms of looking at, the positive impact of, say, positive globalization in the form of expanding communicative power of the people and how that can liberalize the structures in these societies, we also need to talk about the revenues that prop up these regimes in natural resource rich countries. That's what I meant by the role of natural resource extractive industry and the way in which the modern civilization has become so gas and oil dependent.
Well, I think we've just got time for one more question, and then we'll have to call it an evening. And I apologize to other people who wanted to ask questions.
I have a question for Professor Kaldor. In case of extremely closed societies such as North Korea, where the existence of civil society is pretty much invisible, what can be the role of outside actors such as international community to enlarge the civil society and the empower civil society and enlarge those few spaces?
Well, North Korea is indeed a very difficult one, and I think there's rather little that can be done. But I just want to make, I suppose, 2 points. One is the point that Ziba made, which is also a point I made more indirectly, which is that when you have threats and sanctions, that often helps the regime. It doesn't always the case, but it often tends to be the case, just as, you know, the war on terror legitimized the conservatives in Iran. So a more aggressive policy towards North Korea actually helps the hardliners inside North Korea. So one thing is what you shouldn't do. That's one conclusion. The other is, of course, that trying to build connections, trying to help whoever you can find, and it's very difficult to find anybody, but so the most you can do in a place like Korea is to open up. But I think in other places, and Iran and Burma are all very good examples, just engagement and discussion is what is really important, given the argument that we just had that actually the media can be illiberal as well as liberal. Then what's important is for more and more people to engage in debate and discussion in these situations. So that's what I would say has to happen. But I think the central argument is, and I think that's very important, that I think what we're saying, and in a way that was the lesson of the 1989 revolutions, that if you really want to change societies, it does come from below. There's something that the outside can do, but it comes from below. And communication is really key. But below nowadays doesn't just mean inside. Below means that the inside and the outside are blurred. And I think that's the message. That's why, you know, I'm arguing over and over again, communication is key. There may be cases where sanctions and threats are useful, but only if people tell you, we want that. And so that's, I think, the central argument.
Oh, I thought they were really interesting presentations, and would you thank all our panelists for, I think, a really interesting evening. Thanks very much.